We are continuing in a series of messages that we started some time ago about game changers. We're talking about the game changers. We're talking about people who were heroes of faith and how, because of their commitment to God, they changed the game for all of us. And this morning we're looking at Ruth. And I decided to use that letter R all through the message this morning. And so when we look at Ruth, we're looking at redemption, results, and rejoicing. And the story of Ruth is a fascinating story. This is the 12th in our series of the Game Changers. Now, I need to let you know that as we've looked through the book of Hebrews at chapter 11, we've seen this list of all these heroes of faith, men and women alike, who were faithful to God and made a difference, not only in their own lives, but a difference for the people in their day. And ultimately, they brought about a difference for us because of their faithfulness. We have the blessing of Jesus Christ. And so they're all tied into that, and it's tied into it in a New Testament story, telling us about these Old Testament lives. But Ruth is not mentioned by name or by inference in Hebrews chapter 11. Nonetheless, Ruth was a game changer. The characters in this Old Testament book that bears her name were great game changers. And it wasn't just Ruth. It was her mother-in-law, Naomi. It was Boaz, who at the end of the story, she married. They became game changers for all of us. The book of Ruth is a love story. And it's a beautiful love story at that. In this country's infancy, 230 years ago or so, we just celebrated our 240th anniversary as a country this summer. And probably within 10 years of that time, this new United States of America sent out ambassadors to those countries who were their allies, who had helped them, those countries that they were friendly with. Benjamin Franklin became the ambassador to France. He was fluent in French. He loved the French ways. And so for a number of years, our American hero, Benjamin Franklin, lived in Paris. And he lived there speaking on behalf of the United States of America. In his leisure, he enjoyed meeting with other people and other groups. And there was a literary group, a group that loved stories, that he met with regularly. They would share their favorite stories. They would discuss them and talk about all the ramifications of these stories. Now, it's interesting that the group named themselves the Infidels Club. They were interested in stories, but they were not interested in God. They were not interested in the Bible. In fact, by their own name, they were saying, we're rather godless in the way we live and the way we act. Well, Benjamin Franklin wanted to pull a fast one on them. So when it came his time to tell a story, he read the book of Ruth to them, but he changed the names so they would not recognize it. The group rated it as one of the most beautiful short stories they had ever heard. And they demanded from Benjamin Franklin to know where he found this beautiful story. You can imagine how he enjoyed telling them, gentlemen, the story is straight out of the Bible. One of the most beautiful love stories of all time. 4 small chapters there after the book of Judges. And throughout this short romantic story, we see God continuously working behind the scenes to accomplish his purpose. That's God's way. That's what he does. God does not change. And I'm here today to tell you that God is still continuously working behind the scenes in our lives to accomplish his purpose. He has something for us to do. He has a blessing in store for us. But unless we follow him and unless we abide by his will, we'll never discover it. There's 4 chapters, and so there's 4 things I want to talk about in this story from the book of Ruth. First of all, in chapter 1, we are told of Ruth's remorse. Now, here Ruth is portrayed as a desperate and destitute widow. She was a young lady. Turns out that there was a Jewish man during the time of Judges who, because of famine in Israel, moved to Moab with his 3 sons, his wife and his 3 sons. The sons grew up there, and they fell in love with Moabite women. But the husband died, and all three of the sons died. And now there were 4 widows. There was Naomi, the man's wife, and then the widows of their 3 young adult children, who were all non-Jewish. Here's the story. Naomi realized that they all lost their livelihood, and she realized they needed support, and so she told the 3 daughter-in-laws that she dearly loved. She said, I need to go back to my people in Israel. There's family there that might be able to help me. But you're young. You need to stay here, and you need to remarry, and you need to live full lives with your people. 2 of the 3 daughter-in-laws, in tears, agreed, and they separated themselves from Naomi. But one whose name was Ruth, would not. And even though she was risking it all, she said, I will go with you, and I will stay with you. So here's Ruth. She had a lot of strikes against her. She was a Gentile. She was a stranger to the promises of God to the Israelites, and she was lost in her sin. She didn't have a relationship with God. Back in 1985, some of us might remember this, there was a horrible, catastrophic earthquake in Mexico City. Buildings came down. There were just mountains of concrete everywhere. There were fires. There were explosions. And people here in the States were watching all this unfold by live TV. There was a pastor who was sitting in front of his television. He was stunned by the extent of the damage that he saw. Mountains of broken concrete filled the screen. Rescue workers were digging frantically anytime they heard a voice, and they were bloodying their fingers as they were doing it. Fires raged, and dust and smoke filled the air. And then suddenly, in the lower left corner of his TV screen, he saw this statement flash: courtesy, sin. Courtesy, sin? Well, he had to do a little bit of checking, and he found out that the letters SIN actually stood for Spanish International Network. But as he looked at the carnage on the TV set, it dawned on him that all the trouble we have in this world comes from sin. It's all because we have not connected with God. And so, yes, it rains on the righteous and the unrighteous. Yes, a tower can fall on righteous people and kill them. Yes, horrible things can happen, but the world was not meant to be this way. It's when we as humans have sinned that there's been a condemnation even of nature itself. And here is a woman who was apart from God, apart from God's people. She was a woman who needed to know that she had a Savior. And so she made this pledge. In verses 6 through 18, Naomi said, girls, stay home. I'm going back. And with tears, as I said, 2 stayed home. But then we find in chapter 1, starting in verse 16, we find Ruth saying this: don't urge me from leaving you or turning back from you. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. And when Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her to stay in Moab. Now, God calls us to come to Him. And our response needs to be the same. When we hear the call of God, we need to say, where you want me to go, I'll go. What you want me to be, I'll be. I will stay by your side because you have been faithful and you have stayed by my side. It's a time of decision. It's a time of commitment. It's a time to turn remorse into joy. And that's what Ruth was willing to do. There was a gamble there. She was going back to people she didn't belong to. She was going back to ways and cultures that were completely unfamiliar to her. But by seeing the way her godly in-laws lived and the way her husband and his brothers lived, she knew that obviously there is one true God. Now, 40 years ago, next month, Kalita and I recited those very words to each other in our wedding vows. And they fit. They fit because we are saying to each other, we will stay together and nothing but death will separate us. Isn't that what we do when we make wedding vows one to the other? But isn't that what God does with us in this relationship? He says, I want to seal this relationship. I want it real. I want it to count. I don't want you to have remorse anymore. I want you to know joy. So, will you go with me? Ruth's decision was, I will go where God's sending me. And so she was dealing with a serious situation of poverty. She had no husband, no means of support, and neither did Naomi. They left Moab financially bankrupt. They had nothing but their names. And the only hope was that there would be someone back in Israel, a family member, who would take pity and take them in. You know, that's total trust. And when we find ourselves bankrupt in this world, when we find ourselves deflated and defeated by our lives and by our mistakes, and we find ourselves helpless, we have nothing to do but turn to the mercy of a God who wants to rescue us. That is the connection to the first chapter. In the second chapter, Naomi had a request at the end of the chapter, but this came after Naomi realized how God's hand was really at work. In chapter 2, we see that Ruth goes out to glean a field. Now, the Old Testament law dictated that when harvesters came into a field, they would leave the edges and the corners for the poor. And they would come in after the main harvest, and they would go ahead and gather the grains, or they would gather whatever food was being grown in the field, so they'd have something to take home. Naomi said, "Go out and glean for us, my daughter." And she went to this field, and it evidently had produced an abundant crop, and so she started gleaning with the other women who were all Jewish, and here she was, a Moabite. She looked different, she talked different, she acted differently, and they all knew that she's not one of us. And Boaz, who owned the field, took notice. He said, "Who's that woman? And why is she actually walking behind the rest of the others who are gleaning? Why isn't she with them?" It's because she was respecting their culture, and she wasn't part of that culture, and she figured, I'll pick up what they don't. And Boaz put a stop to that. And he said, you get right in there with all the others who are gleaning. And in fact, let me give you some more. Let me make sure you don't go home empty-handed. Boaz gave her water to drink and made sure that she wasn't cut off. Do you remember the days before civil rights? Most of us in this room, I'd say many of us in this room, weren't born before civil rights laws were enacted. But the days in which in the Deep South there were white water fountains and there were colored water fountains. And you wouldn't cross the border. You couldn't. You weren't allowed because you were different. Boaz put a stop to that. He said, you make sure she gets all the water she wants. And then when it was time to eat, Boaz looked at his harvesters and he said, make room at our table for this Moabite woman because she's working so hard for someone else, for her mother-in-law. And so we see that Ruth was even able to sit at the table and to eat with them. And so with all this protection given to her, she went home with a huge amount of gleanings. And she showed all this barley to Naomi, and she said, where in the world did you get this? And she explained, and then she said his name was Boaz. It was his field. And Naomi got so excited because she realized that Boaz was a distant relative of her husband. And she said, I'll tell you what, you go back and you do what I tell you to do, and God is going to bless this. And so Naomi came up with this request for Ruth to follow her directions, and Ruth was willing to do so. Well, in the third chapter, we see Boaz's response to this generosity or this favor that was being shown him by Ruth. In the third chapter, they've harvested the grain, and it was a barley harvest. And they would take all of that grain, all that stock, to a threshing floor, and there they would spend time threshing it. Now, the workers, because they were in a remote place, stayed in the field at night so that they could get an early start in the morning. It also protected what they were already growing so someone wouldn't raid the grain and take the barley away from them. So Boaz was sleeping out there with the other workers, and here's what Ruth was told to do. She was told to take a bath, wash yourself, and make sure that you are clean and presentable. And that washing very much reflects how in Jesus Christ we find ourselves washed in baptism, and that we have this sense of pureness and forgiveness that comes, and cleansing that comes from Jesus himself. She anointed herself with oil. She put a perfume on. And for us as Christians, it's a picture of being filled with the Holy Spirit, who is God's anointing to us. If we sincerely desire to be as close to Jesus as possible, we need to be filled with his Spirit and be looking and smelling like his Spirit. And then she was clothed. She wore some of her best garments. And for us, as Christians, we are clothed in a robe of righteousness that comes from Jesus Christ. It declares that we belong to him. We are told that those of us who are baptized have clothed ourselves or robed ourselves with Jesus Christ. And then the last thing she did is she quietly went to where Boaz was sleeping. She lifted up his blanket at his feet, and she kind of snuggled in so the warmth of her body were on his feet. And it startled him. What's this? You know, you're out in the middle of open field, and you feel something warm in the middle of the night, kind of tickling your toes. What are you going to think? And he realized, that's not a wild varmint, that's a woman. Who are you? I am Ruth. And I am laying myself at your feet. Now you notice she didn't come and lay beside him. She didn't come and lay on top of him. She was totally respectful, and she laid at his feet to warm his feet. And so she was blessed. Boaz knew her intentions were sincere and real, and there wasn't any hanky-panky that was going to happen there. And then she was covered. He covered her with his robe. And this is a picture of us being covered by Jesus Christ and covered by his blood. All my past, with all its scars and all its failures, is gone. It's forever taken away because I have been covered by Jesus. He still does that for sinners today. He still does that for people who will go to his feet and will make him Lord. It's such a beautiful story. And it was a great payoff. The plan worked. Boaz agreed to redeem Ruth and Naomi. His love for her was very evident. But thank God, God sees us in our need, and he says, I will send a Redeemer to you. And that Redeemer is Jesus Christ. And his love for us is very evident. He still loves sinners today, and he loves you, and he loves me. And so from there we go to the final chapter of the story. In the fourth chapter, we see Ruth's redemption. There was a proposition that was made. They had a law in the Old Testament about redeeming the property and the fortunes of a dead relative. And there had to be the closest relative to that person who died was the one who got the first opportunity, the first shot to redeem whatever properties, basically to receive the inheritance. Obviously, Naomi's husband had no children to give it to. All his sons had died. And so here it was, open. But to protect it, to keep it within the people of God, the people of Israel, they had this rule of the kinsman redeemer, a family redeemer. And so Boaz looked at Ruth and he said, I can be your kinsman redeemer, but I'm not the closest relative to your father-in-law. There is another cousin who is closer. I'll go to him and talk to him. So the next day he went to him, and in the presence of people from the community at the city gate, he said, Naomi's husband has died. She has come back, and there is property involved. You're the kinsman redeemer. Would you like to redeem the property? Well, there was acreage. There was some land involved, but also the property were the women. And the man said at first, yes, I'm glad to do that. Get some free property? Sure. And then Boaz said, oh, there's one thing. You also get his widow, and you get his daughter-in-law, and you have to take care of them the rest of your life. And he said, whoa, wait a minute. He said, that's going to upset the cart, first of all, with my wife, and it's also going to upset my finances. I can't afford to do that. You take them. And so Boaz, in front of this group of witnesses, these friends, these community members, he said, you've all heard it. And they said, we heard it. And so the deal was struck. And Boaz had the responsibility for taking care of Ruth and taking care of her mother-in-law, Naomi, the rest of his life. And it was a joy. It was a joy. It wasn't so much a sacrifice because it was a relationship that they had established. He made the proposition. He secured the purchase. And then there was a profit. And I'm not talking about someone who foresees the future when I say there was a profit, but there was a profit as far as some type of bonus to him personally. Profit. Here's the profit. This was the profit to Ruth. Remember, Ruth was a Gentile. But also remember that according to the 4th chapter of Ruth, in the very end of that chapter, we have kind of a postscript. And it says in 4:16 of Ruth 4, that Naomi took the child. Ruth had a child after they married, after Boaz and she married. Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The women living there said, Naomi has a son. In essence, it wasn't her flesh and blood son, but it was given to her in the absence of her own boys. And they named him Obed. Now get this. And Obed was the father of Jesse, the father of David. What? Ruth was the grandmother of King David. What else does that mean? That means Ruth, a Moabite Gentile woman, is in the family line of Jesus Christ. Just like we talked about last week with Rahab, a prostitute that had repented and turned to God is in the family line of Jesus Christ. And now here's another Gentile woman showing up in the family line. What a prophet. You see, when we turn to God, he changes every aspect of our lives. Jesus is in the business delivery. In John 10, verse 10, Jesus said, a thief comes only to steal and destroy, but I came to give you life and to give it to you abundantly. And that's what happens when we have a relationship with a God who sends us a Redeemer. And that Redeemer's name is Jesus. It's a nice story, right? Love the story. But it really doesn't make a difference in my life, right? Wrong. It makes a huge difference for 2 reasons. First of all, God notices people of good character. And he pays attention to us as we pay attention to him. And secondly, what is good and what is worthwhile will come to us if we are patient and if we commit ourselves to doing what is right in the eyes of God. It did for Ruth, and it will for us. We need to understand in this day of instant gratification, it's good to be reminded of this timeless lesson, not only from the book of Ruth, but from the Apostle Paul. He told the Galatians in chapter 6 and verse 9, let us not grow weary in doing good, for in due season we shall reap a harvest if we do not lose heart. And so it boils down to this, folks. Follow God's lead. Abide by his will. And if we follow God's lead and abide by his will, if we follow the example of a godly woman named Ruth, our redemption will be a game changer, not just for us, but our redemption will be a game changer for someone else. Regardless of where you are today, Jesus can do in your life and much more what Boaz was able to do for Ruth. Jesus can redeem you. Jesus can bring you close to him. Jesus can bless you beyond your imagination and your wildest dreams. He is waiting to do this. And he only wants us to come. and surrender at his feet and give our lives to him. He wants us. Those blessings are ours because of faith. And for the 12th Sunday in a row, I want you to remember this verse. Without faith, it is impossible to please God. It's time to please God. It's time to be washed. It's time to be anointed. It's time to be filled with his presence. It's time to quit making excuses and surrender at the feet of Jesus and let him lift you up. Without faith, it is impossible to please God. If you need to make a decision for Jesus, whether it's to accept him and be baptized, whether it's to recommit your life, whether it's to be a member of this church having already been a baptized believer, we invite you because he invites you. And he wants you to be a game changer. Let's learn from this story by making this our story as well. And if you're ready to do that, you can come forward as we stand and as we sing this song, and we will help you discover your Redeemer, the Lord Jesus Christ.